A while I worked as an executive chef in San Francisco. We had Melissa Etheridge in the Grand Ballroom, and we had Bette Midler all the way on the top suite. We got the food out, and lo and behold, drunken Bette Midler decides to come into the kitchen to see what we're doing. And she comes in barefoot. Hair looks like she stuck her finger in a socket, and she has been drinking quite a bit, and she was bringing in bottles for the kitchen staff, which we can't do. And as she's being her normal self, she didn't like her soup. And her soup that she specifically ordered was a chicken soup. And she proceeds to let me know that I didn't know how to make chicken soup. And during the course of my casual conversation with her, trying to explain to her that it's exactly the recipe she gave us, she noticed that I was wearing a Star of David. And she said, "You're such a good Jewish boy, but you don't know how to make chicken soup." She says, "What's your mother's phone number?" I'm like, I got very quiet and I looked at the clock and I'm like, okay, my mother is well in bed. So after badgering, I gave her my mother's number. And as I gave her my mother's number, in comes Melissa Etheridge, screaming at the top of her lungs that there had to have been chicken broth or beef broth in her soup, and that some kind of meat was on her plate. So my sous chef went to go take care of her, and they were maybe about 5 feet apart. So my mother proceeds to answer the phone as Bette Midler calls, and Bette Midler proceeds to fetch with my mother about the soup. And my mother is trying to explain to her nicely on the phone that my son doesn't know how to make matzo ball soup because we're not that kind of a Jew. So Bette Midler is proceeding to tell my mother how to make matzo ball soup and how to make chicken soup and how she should take notes so she can teach me how to do it. And being that Melissa Etheridge is raising her voice louder and louder and louder, and Bette Midler is trying to speak to my mother on the phone, Bette Midler asks my mother politely, "Sweetheart, can you please hold the line?" And I was like, uh-oh. And she turned to Melissa Etheridge and says, "Would you kindly shut the..." and explicit out. And she says, "What kind of woman could you possibly be? You've never had any kind of meat pass through your lips." And that ruined the evening. Melissa Etheridge turned around, walked out. Bette Midler proceeded to tell my mother, "Good night, sweetie." Handed me the phone, and my kitchen staff and I just stood there and looked at each other like, what just happened? And that's how my night ended. And then, of course, bright and early the next day, my mother asks me, she says, "Mijo, you're in San Francisco." I'm like, "Yes, Mom, I know." She's like, "And I know San Francisco very well because we've lived there for quite a long time." And I says, "Yes, Mom." She says, "I have one thing to ask you." I said, "What, Mom?" She says, "Please stop hanging out with drag queens." And that's how that morning ended.
And I became a motion picture film editor in New York City. One of my early jobs was as an apprentice or an assistant. There are lots of gradations. And I was working on a film that starred Warren Beatty. It was a film starring Warren Beatty, Peter Fonda, and a woman named Jean Seberg. Has anyone ever heard of Jean Seberg?
Swedish.
Well, she was an American girl who went to France and became famous by starring in Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless. And anyway, she was back in the United States. A woman of scant talent, but some celebrity. Anyway, we were working on a film with Robert Rawson. He was the director, and Warren was the star. Post-production, we were in the dubbing studio, dubbing background soundtracks, things like that. And as film is always done, you do it until you drop. It's all about the banks. It's all about who's holding the loans and how quickly you can start paying back the money by releasing the film. So we were 2 a.m. every night, always, just to maximize time. And 2 a.m. we were just coming out of the dubbing studio, exhausted and drained. And I had not really had anything to do with Warren one-on-one. I was just one of the people in the back room working. And he he intersected my path as I was going out onto the street, and I was going to get a bus and go home to my apartment. And he started talking to me, and he said, well, it's pretty late at night, you must be pretty tired. Why don't you let me drive you home? At that point, a limousine pulled up to the curb, and he swished open the door, and he's gesturing to the back seat. I mean, I was like 23, 24, and all I can think of, if I get in that back seat, when and where am I ever getting out? This is the beginning of a career, but maybe a nefarious one. So I just became terrified. I became embarrassed and thought, oh, I am not in this league. And I just thanked him very much for his courtesy and walked on to the bus stop.